Welcome everybody to live Q&A, those online. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave, and with me is Recovering Heretic Dan.
Yes, and here we are. Boy, we have a vast gulf between us. I'm looking at
We do.
Here, I'm gonna.
Vast gulf,
There.
which no one can bridge, as Jesus says.
All right, and we are on part 4 of looking at the Augsburg Confessions.
Right, where we've only made it to Article 4,
Yes.
so it's going to take us a while. Right.
Article 4 was pretty important. That was 2 episodes by itself. And that's part of why I'm enjoying doing this, because it's really getting into the roots
Of Lutheranism.
of
yes.
Lutheranism.
Yes.
But before we get to the roots of Lutheranism, the roots of Judeo-Islamo-Christianity
Yes.
itself. Today's reading was the whole story of Cain and Abel.
Right.
And so Steve has a question. The whole thing that motivates Cain, gets him brewing toward murder,
Yeah.
is the fact that God rejects his sacrifice and accepts Abel's.
Uh-huh.
And so Steve wants to know, why did God reject Cain's offering in the first place? I mean, didn't God actually light the fire on all this?
Bible doesn't say. We get no... Yeah, sorry, Steve. We get no explanation. It's just one of those things.
We can only speculate.
Yeah, I mean, some people read into it, explains, it goes into that line about. Some people read a lot into that line about it says Abel offered the choicest, and that implying that Cain didn't do that.
So that Cain's wasn't a real sacrifice because it was just like the leftovers.
Just like the leftovers, or it wasn't the very best, the fattest portions,
Yeah.
There's probably a sociological, anthropological thing going on of the conflict between settled farmers and pastoral herding nomads,
Just like the Old West.
Right. You got to remember the Israelites were pastoral nomad, they were not settled farmers.
Yeah.
They were, and so there's probably some anthropological thing going on there. The book of Hebrews says it's faith that makes the difference, right? There's chapter 12 of Hebrews says, by faith, starts off with Abel. Mm-hmm. Abel's sacrifice was deemed worthy before God, and Cain's wasn't, by faith, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
And so that's Hebrews' explanation, much later, obviously, but, in Christian. So, and the author of Hebrews is using that to make a point about, by faith we receive the promises of Jesus in general,
Yeah.
relating to our thing. So you can do with that what you will.
So Abel had more genuine faith.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between knowledge and genuine faith, right? I mean, even the demons know that God exists, right? Knowing that God exists, Cain has a conversation with him, right? And so knowing that he exists is different than, faith, which is trust in God's promises,
okay.
And so... you can do what you will with the Hebrews. Again, Hebrews is using it for a point. The Bible itself talks about the scandal of its message sometimes. And in the New Testament, the scandal is that God dies on the cross in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That's the scandal, hard thing to wrap your mind around.
Right. And reinforcing, because we clearly forget this today, that death on the cross was like the lowest, most undignified way to go. It was
right. It's like this shame-inducing, that God would go through that is the scandal of the New Testament. The scandal of the Old Testament is that God is particular. That God chooses some and doesn't choose others. And so, and why this never gets fully explained, and God doesn't feel a need to explain himself, which is
like when a parent says, "I don't have to explain myself to you."
Right, exactly. I mean, it's just God's just like, I don't, tough nuggies, you know, like, and in a certain way, you're right. The problem is started off with God, you know. You just got to accept that, you know, like there's no explanation, and God doesn't feel the need to explain himself. All he says to Cain is, you better master your sin before it gets out of control.
Yeah.
You know?
So maybe that's why he kind of, makes Cain functionally immortal, because he feels guilty that he actually started all this.
Well, yeah, I mean, or, I don't know, right? I don't know if God feels guilty about it, but, I don't even know if he's immortal. We don't really know what the mark of Cain actually is,
Well, Drew and I were talking about the fact he was saying on Lucifer.
Oh, right. I mean,
that
Lucifer, supernatural. Everybody loves this, and I've seen everything from it's a horn on his head to, it's a big black dog that follows him around, something, right? Like, who knows? It just doesn't say what it is.
Yeah.
So,
but whatever it is, it protects him.
Right.
From
whatever.
harm.
Well, it stops people from killing him.
Yeah.
Right. And then you get the genealogy of Cain and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
And Cain builds the first city and,
Where are Adam and Eve in all this?
having another son, Seth.
So they're
I mean,
they're back on a romantic getaway when all this is going
I
on?
don't know where they are. Oh, I don't know where they are when the Bible doesn't.
Because they're not being very parental,
Yeah, I mean, Bible doesn't say, again, this is one of those things where the Bible's not very introspective, so we don't get, Eve or Adam's internal monologue as this is all going on.
It's just like a plot outline.
Right,
Sacrifice made, Cain gets jealous, Cain kills Abel, Cain gets Mark, the end.
Right. Well, and its briefness is actually where I think a lot of it, if there was more of it, I don't think it'd be as beautiful, tragically beautiful a story, right? It's, there's a monument to the Holocaust at my seminary, because it's in Bexley, so there's a lot of Jewish folk there, and it's got, part of it is panels where just sentences of this story are written, and, there's just one marble panel that says, and then Cain rose up against his brother, in the field, and it's like that. It is beautiful in its starkness, how simple it is, and just that simple question, what have you done?
Yeah.
Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, what have you done? It's like, yeah, you don't really need to ask more questions than that.
Yeah.
What is this thing you have done?
And every child knows the fear that comes in when the parent asks you, what have you done?
Right. Yeah, right. What have you done? It's like, am I my brother's keeper? It's like,
Yeah, well, I liked you're out on that. That doesn't mean you have to be your sister's keeper.
Right, I tried. It didn't work. Right. And so I guess I think, to a certain extent, yeah, I hear you, Steve. It does get started because of God in many ways, but God doesn't feel like he owes us an explanation. So
we just don't know.
Right. So we just don't know.
One more question on the Cain front, and then off we go back to the Augsburg Confession. Cain establishes the first city. Who with?
Good question also, He marries somebody, I don't know who.
Who are these other people then? I mean, just in general, right? Or,
who are these?
Are Adam and Eve really the first humans? In which case you got this whole quandary of who Cain married and started establishing the city with.
Right.
Or were they simply the first people in the line of people we're concerned about in the Bible, in that storyline?
Yeah, I mean, it could be either, Adam just means, it's from the Hebrew word Adamah. It just means ground or dirt. Like literally, he's the earthling. Like that's literally,
Yeah.
And so, does that mean he's the only earthly?
He's just the only one in our story.
Right. He's just the only one in our story, right? Bible's, again, it's one of those things where that's not the Jeopardy question, right? I talk about the Old Testament as a game of Jeopardy. And,
Yeah.
how did humans come to be is not quite, the question they're asking, right? So they're not very concerned about where the other people are coming from, or like, who knows, and biblical literalists try very hard to rationalize it all, it's like, meh.
But the writers weren't being literal.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe they were, right? I mean, but they're just not concerned. That's not a world building question they care to answer. It's like, how does Tolkien's magic system work? There's no explanation to that. It's just Gandalf can do things, and
which has bugged me. I was hoping there'd be something in the appendix.
Right. And how does more, Sauron's magic work? He can do things too, bad things, and you don't get much more than that, and is Tolkien interested in answering that question for you? Not at all, and kind of similarly, the Bible is like, the author of Genesis, not interested in answering the question for you, where the other people came from, who Cain marries,
I'll tell you, that author has quite vexing for people like me and Steve.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's better storytelling. I mean, it's vexing, but it's better storytelling, right? Like, what would that actually get you out of the story?
A spin-off series.
Right. Cain and his wife, I think overall, if you really wanted to answer that question, I would think about Adam and Eve as representative of humanity as a whole, not the only humans. They are
not actually individuals.
Right. I would look at them as representatives of people, and so, you get things like, the first murder occurs over religion and jealousy, and and a conflict between settled farmers and nomadic pastoralists, and it's like, well, yeah, there it is. There's, 90% of human history, right? Like,
encapsulated in these like 3 paragraphs,
right? In 15 verses, ta-da, one of my history profs at Calvin always used to say, now what's the number one problem in all of history? Central Asian nomadic invaders. And it's like, you can sum up a lot of history with, brother rose up against brother.
Yeah.
Brother was jealous over something brother had.
Wow.
Yeah,
Steve apologizes, by the way, so he didn't mean to open this can of worms.
No, I mean, it's fine. They're good questions, Steve. They really are. And I would say, the grace of, I could preach a whole sermon on this. There's a whole book written by a guy named Jack O'Lule on this. But, that line later in chapter 4 about how Cain founds the first city, it's one of those evidence of like God takes this thing which is created by the murderer, it's literally created in blood, and at the end of the story, the revelation is not a return to the garden, but a city, and so God takes this thing created by murder and bloodshed and redeems it, and says this is the final destination for the end, for the final culmination of history, is, the glorious city, and I think there's some hope in that, and God can even take these things we've created in utter bloodshed and redeem them, for better purposes.
Yeah. I want to hold on to that one.
Yeah.
It's a nice thought.
Yeah.
Get something good out of bad things.
You're right.
But let's get back to the Augsburg. Let's try to get at least to one of them every week.
Right. Let's get to one. Right. Let's get through a couple. We can probably bang out the next.
Yeah, we probably can. So number 5 on the Augsburg Confessions is the office of preaching.
Yep.
And it says here that means to ensure that the gospel is proclaimed throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And was that all there was to it? Was that something they agreed on? at Augsburg?
I don't remember if 5 is disputed. I think, read the whole article to me again.
The office of preaching to ensure that the gospel of Jesus is proclaimed throughout the world, and Christ has established his office of the holy ministry.
Okay. I don't think they had too much of a problem with it, although their emphasis would have been more on the sacraments, you know. The preaching moment is actually incredibly important for us. It's not just like this little lecture I give to hear myself talk, right? You know, it's it has a form. There's a form it's supposed to follow, or otherwise it's not a sermon. It's just a speech. You know.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What's the basic outline then?
Well, the basic outline is law and gospel. So it's supposed to convince you you're a sinner, and then convince you that Jesus Christ has saved you from your sins. You know, and if it doesn't do both those things, it's just a nice talk. You know, and so. And that's because it's through that hearing that message of law and gospel that we then have faith, receive faith. You know, it's that hearing that I am a sinner and yet Jesus saves me from my sins. You know, that we have faith, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a peculiar kind of speaking because it has a form that it's for Lutherans. Lutherans are very big on this, you know. For Lutherans, it's necessary to follow, and you know, and so there are certain things I would never do in a sermon that even like other denominations would do, and I don't do them because they don't fit within that, you know, what we believe the sermon is supposed to accomplish, which is that you be convinced you're a sinner and be restored in faith to trusting Jesus' promises.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and you hit on something there. Is this why there's such this wide breadth of, I don't know, not just the sermon, but what qualifies as being a preacher? Because you have something like, you know, with Lutherans, you go to seminary. Episcopals, you go to seminary. Obviously, Catholics, you go to seminary. Orthodox, you go to seminary.
Yeah.
But I've had friends who go to churches where there's no requirement for any formal training for the pastor. You know, they kind of hit this circuit and end up finding a church that takes them. And
yeah, it's a little. Yes, I mean our kind of mainline reliance on training is part of that. You know, we want you to know Scripture well so that you can clearly articulate the law and the gospel. You know, and know Greek so that you can clearly, you know, you're not just making up crap. That you can actually go back and check what
look at the source material.
Right, what the source material says, and you know Hebrew so that you know, all that stuff, right? That's part of it. And you take systematics so that you can learn the full theory of law and gospel and things like that, you know. That's part of it, yeah. I mean, I would also say a lot of those denominations just have a different understanding of what pastor is, you know. Lutherans use the word pastor almost unlike any other denomination, you know. Often the word for my office is not pastor, but reverend, you know, or, you know, right. Now I only use reverend when I'm trying to get somebody's attention and or I'm angry, you know, like.
That's when you pull the title out.
Yeah, right. It's like, am I dealing with an idiot or like, am I particularly angry? You know, then the reverend comes out, you know, or I'm at like a really formal function. You know, if I'm with politicians or something, I'm the reverend, you know, like, but mostly people just call me pastor, and that's in the Lutheran church, that's our code word for the ordained one, you know. Okay. That is not true for most other denominations. And pastor is a word for a job that somebody does within the church, pastoring, you know, that is not necessarily tied to the ordained one. The ordained one should do it, some of it, but a lot of other people can do it too. So there's the youth pastor and the pastor for visitation, you know, and all those people are kind of in that line. It's also not that they don't receive training, it's that they don't receive formal education. You know, often they'll get to the formal education step, you know, but their training, they have a very clear path that most of those, you know, you start as a youth minister, you then get promoted to you take another step up the rung, you know, and like you keep going until you get your own church kind of thing, and that's often, it's actually a lot of training. It's just very hands-on.
Experiential.
It's like a decades-long internship, it's kind of thing.
Wow.
So
what would they have, back in the 16th century, what would they have meant by the office of preaching then?
Well, they mean the kind of sermon that like Luther gives and I give. And,
okay.
I mean, you got to remember, not all Catholic services featured preaching at all times, right? I mean, often you had preaching when you had a Dominican wandering through town, but like receiving the sacraments was far more important than, the sermon. To this day, Catholics preach every service now, but, they're not, that's never their focus. It never has been.
The sacraments have always been.
Yeah, the sacraments are more, and we agree on the sacraments, just we say the sacraments and the office of preaching, that you can't separate them.
Okay. I'm absorbing that. How is that, is there any difference between that and the Orthodox as well? And a lot of times I go back to the Orthodox just because it is still so steeped in ancient tradition.
Yeah, I mean, they still have sermons, but again, they wouldn't hang as much on them as like we probably would.
Okay.
I mean, again, it's participation for the Orthodox, it's participation in the sacramental and liturgical life of the church, is kind of the main focus, right? It's both of those things, but, the sacramental liturgical life of the church is where it really, the heart of the thing is for them. And, and again, we don't disagree with that. We just say preaching's really important. I think a lot hangs on every sermon that I preach, and not that I'm have this ego of myself, but it's like, if it's not just my random musings, and I don't do things like some pastors do, like education sermons where they just teach you about something, and I don't do that because I think that's not what the sermon is.
What its function is.
Right, it's not what its function. My actual goal is not really to teach you anything. My goal is to convince you you're a sinner.
Yeah.
If you learn something along the way, wonderful, but that's the goal of Bible study, not sermons.
Yeah.
A sermon is this moment where I'm trying to kill you with the word and bring you back to life. If I haven't accomplished that, I've done something other than a sermon,
Okay. And so like the Q&A, this is the education
component. Right, this is the education piece, right? And this is why we have this, is because I don't do that in my sermons. So, if Steve has a question about Cain and Abel, now he can ask,
But on that line, didn't you, and I may be totally wrong, I may have just dreamed this, but at some point didn't you say that it's okay in the Lutheran Church, and possibly even expected, that if a member of the congregation disagrees with something you're saying in the sermon, they can stand up and say, wait a minute.
Well, right. I mean, that was actually what was happening, and that's actually why we have the Apostles' Creed used to be said in Luther's original liturgy. The Apostles' Creed is said before the sermon, not after, so that if the pastor preaches any heresy, you can know because it disagreed with something you just said. I mean, yeah, but that again, that's like that's not like I've said something factual. Heresy isn't just factually incorrect. Like heresy is I've confused law and gospel. That I've said you are saved by your works. That's when you're supposed to stand up and do that stuff.
Yeah.
When I've made some fundamental confusion about what's law and what's gospel, then that's what we're talking about.
And we can do that right in the middle of the sermon.
Well, I mean,
or is there supposed to be a pause at the end where you say, any question?
Well,
dost thou challenge me?
Right, dost thou challenge? I mean, people were doing that in the 1600s. Like that was actually a problem as Luther's stuff spread. Like Catholics were experiencing in church. Catholic priests, they would say something, and somebody would be like, "That's not what Dr. Luther says," And I wouldn't recommend doing. I won't look happily upon that actually happening, because good order. I mean, it'll say later in the confessions, good order is important too.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of things we do not because the Bible commands us, but just because they're good for good order.
Okay. And that good order seems to lead to this one. Number 6, Article 6, is of the new obedience.
Yeah.
Good deeds of Christians are the fruits of faith and salvation, not a price paid for them. That seems to hit right onto indulgences.
Well, I mean, it's the fundamental distinction. The Lutherans get, even today, people who don't understand what Luther was saying would say, "Oh, you don't have to do anything to be saved." And it's like, well, yes and no. Do I have to pay for my salvation via good works? No. But out of this unlimited free grace should come this new obedience. Out of this unlimited grace should come this sense of, holiness and right living. If there's no reflection of that, then there's a fundamental problem in, starting with your faith life.
Yeah.
Not that we'll get it perfectly, but it's a question of, it's kind of like a math problem. If you do the order of operations wrong, you get a really funky answer.
Yeah.
And like Lutherans kind of think about it as a math problem where it's like, grace plus faith equals salvation, which then leads to good works, should, whereas the Catholics would kind of say grace plus faith plus works of charity at Luther's time equals salvation, and it's like, where do you put, we both think that it's a necessary component of the equation, but it's like, where does it
which side of the
equal sign does it get put on is, the fundamental problem, the fundamental issue,
Does that hold true across Christian denominations? Is that a common tenet?
Yeah, I mean, we all agree Jesus saves. We all agree faith is some component of it, and so I think all those basics are agreed upon. It's then, right, where does good works fall on the equation side? And is justification like a once and done thing, or is it an ongoing process, would be our kind of one of the other major questions, A lot of even our Protestant brothers and sisters would talk about justification as we talked about this last week, but as a past tense thing.
Yeah.
And we would speak of it as a ongoing process, not just a past tense thing. So, those would be kind of the major differences.
I like that. 2 minutes to go.
We can do one more.
Let's try it. That's why I'm throwing that out there. Confession number 7 of the church.
Yes.
There is one holy Christian church, and it is found wherever the gospel is preached in its truth and purity, and the sacraments are administered according to the gospel. So preaching the gospel, doing the sacraments, or administering the sacraments.
Yeah, I mean,
seems to define what the one holy Christian church is.
Right. The church is defined by, preaching the gospel, right administration of the sacraments. These are the two defining things. So the grace side of this, I often say, it's a low bar to clear to be church. I say this to Michael all the time. Michael's probably sick of me saying it, but like word and sacrament, that's all you need. If everything else goes wrong, everything in the booth, all the mics, if the lights start falling out of the sky and everything's squealing, you know what? It's okay, because all we need for it to be proper church is word and sacrament. That's it.
That's it.
And so it's a low bar to clear. I find a lot of comfort in that,
Yeah.
It also means there's a low bar for unity, well, in a certain way. We are united anywhere, regardless of denomination. The church, Lutherans think about the unity of the church differently than most Christians do, in that we would say unity is not something we achieve, but unity is a gift God gives the church.
Okay.
And so the church is already united across time and space and across denominational boundaries, wherever these two things are happening.
So in that regard, it is truly Catholic with the lower C.
Right, it is. Right, it's truly Catholic. And so we don't need to work at, Lutherans would say, you'll hear a lot of Christians, well-meaning Christians, I think, say something like, oh, it's such a scandal that church is divided, and I get what they mean. But Lutherans always want to say, well, it's always united, even if we're in different denominations. We're united in as long as, we're agreed on these two, as long as these two principles are upheld in your church, and so, when Jesus prays in John that his followers would be one. So this is a great example of law and gospel. When Jesus prays in John, may my followers be one as we are one. Says Jesus, right? Law and gospel, right? So is that law, is that a command, something we have to achieve, right? Something we have to work at?
Yeah.
Or is that gospel? Is that because Jesus prayed it, is it a gift Jesus gives the church and it's already given to us regardless of our work?
Yeah.
Lutherans would say, it's actually a gift God gives the church. It's not something we achieve. Even if there's denominational differences, the church is still united because it's a gift of the church. If there's a Catholic priest who's proclaiming the gospel correctly and doing the sacraments correctly, I am in union with him. We are united because we're just united anywhere that bar is cleared.
Okay. Is there disagreement on what constitutes sacraments then?
Well, yeah, there's lots of, right, so that's a much bigger topic, but we should probably save for next time.
Okay.
But the short version is we Lutherans would acknowledge the joke is 2.5 sacraments. The Catholics acknowledge 7. So the numbering is different, although Lutherans typically don't want to get too hung up on, we don't like getting hung up on the numbering. We think it gets us into Catholic debates that we just kind of want to roll our eyes at. But there are differences of the sacraments. There just are, and we could do that next time. But 2.5 is usually how it's numbered in Lutheranism. Because we're not quite, there's baptism, there's Holy Communion, those are the two. The half is depending on how you read what Luther says about confession, private confession. He can't quite work his way up to calling it a sacrament, but he can't quite not call it a sacrament. So it's left in this gray area that,
Yeah. So in all his writings, his voluminous writings, we're still in a gray area on confession.
Yeah, because he can't quite. He thinks it's really important, but he doesn't think he can order you to do private confession. But he thinks it's important, but he can't quite call it a sacrament because for him, there's no physical sign attached to it. There's nothing like the bread or the water, but he thinks it's a command Jesus tells us to do, but he doesn't think you can be compelled to do it. So his writings kind of waffle back and forth where he's at on it.
We're still unsettled.
He's not a systematician. This is about as systematic as Lutheranism gets, and even this is not systematic in the way Calvin writes a 4-book volume called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he just starts at the very foundations of what he thinks theology is and kind of works through everything. And that's not Luther. Luther just doesn't. Luther is not Luther has many gifts. He is not a systematician. And he doesn't want to be. And he kind of thinks the whole enterprise is silly,
To begin with. So he's got no motivation.
Right, he's got no motivation to. So, yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, we've got a wrap.
All right.
We got through 2.
We got through 2. We can
We're
probably pick
improving.
up on sacraments.
Yeah, well, this could be interesting because next time, what the church is, that's how we're going to start. And that should open a lot of doors for me and Steve both.
Right. 7 is really important because it's the foundation of a lot of our theology,
Okay. That sounds good. So, yeah, and just like this week, if you have questions unrelated to the confessions, no problem. We'll do those first, and then we'll come back to the confessions. That's our baseline.
Yep.
So thank you, and thanks for getting us off to a good start today.
Peace.
Toodly doodly.